Sorry for. The third speaker is Bruce Bennett, sitting on my right-hand side, who is a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation, and who is focusing on different dimensions and aspects of strategy, nuclear strategy and conventional strategy, and his main research focus over the past few years has been Northeast Asia. He has written extensively on the North Korean nuclear effort, on the stability, strategic stability or instability in the Korean Peninsula, and the complex relationship between or among the United States, Japan, and the Koreas. Please, Mr. Bennett.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk with you a little bit about the kind of situation we face in Korea in terms of missile defense. There are many similarities between this situation in Korea and the situation that Israel faced today. Your countries are in many ways similar, and so it is a significant concern in terms of what they are facing, though, with the much larger threat that North Korea has tried to pose. So, all right, am I supposed to? There we go. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the size of that threat. When you want to try to characterize the size of the North Korean threat to include both missiles and weapons of mass destruction, the bottom line is we don't know for sure what there is in North Korea. North Korea does an excellent job of trying to hide their military capabilities. Nevertheless, we believe that North Korea has about 1,000 theater ballistic missiles, as shown there on the right, and considerable numbers of chemical and nuclear weapons and probably biological weapons as well. So all of the kinds of threats we've been talking about today are on the table. In fact, many people postulate that North Korea probably would use relatively few of its ballistic missiles with conventional warheads. They would be mainly armed with weapons of mass destruction. So what about those missiles themselves? And these come from a number of different reports. Many of these missiles are relatively short range, especially the Scud missiles, the Toksa. Even the Nodong missile is fairly short range. But it gives you an idea of the numbers we're talking about 1,000 total. For them, only about 100 to 200 launchers that are available. So they can't launch all of those missiles simultaneously. Many of them would have to be left in storage somewhere and then reloaded after the launcher fires once, and then reloaded again and again. And that becomes the nature of the interaction in the system. Now, what about North Korean intent? Again, we don't know a whole lot about their intent. Nevertheless, these are a couple of quotes that have come from different sources. The middle one is perhaps the most interesting one. In 1993, Kim Il-sung was concerned about the first nuclear crisis that occurred in Korea, and he called together his generals and he asked them, if we have to fight the United States, can we win? And the generals reportedly argued, oh yeah, we'll win. And then he asked them, but if we lose, what do we do? Now the generals were very smart. They knew that was not a question they wanted to answer. But reportedly, his son, Kim Jong-il, responded, I will be sure to destroy the earth. What good is the earth without North Korea? Now, at first blush, you must say, oh, come on, North Korea destroying the earth, really? But think about it. If North Korea used a significant number of nuclear weapons, 5 or 10 or 20, and accompanied that with a significant amount of contagious biological weapon use, he's not going to destroy the earth, but he's going to cause a whole lot of damage. I mean, we talked this morning about one nuclear weapon going off in Tel Aviv and how bad it was. We're talking about something considerably greater. And note the other thing about this statement, he didn't preclude China as a target. You will notice in many of the interactions between North Korea and China in recent years that there is an increasing Chinese realization that they could also be a target. Now, let's say if you do target Seoul, for example, if North Korea were to do that, what are we talking about in terms of effects? This was done with the basic simulation model, calculating that if North Korea used a 10-kiloton ground-burst weapon, relatively small weapon, but within the range they've tested, they could kill about 180,000 people with serious casualties in the 350,000 people range. And the numbers vary depending upon where the weapon goes off. So we did some sensitivity testing. Note the economic implications, though. About $0.2 to $1.5 trillion of damage that would be done with one nuclear weapon. Now people say, wait a minute, these Patriot missiles, they're really expensive. They're going to cost $5 million each. If you're stopping that much damage, the cost of that missile is trivial. It's not, as was argued this morning, the trade-off between the cost of the missile and the cost of the interceptor. It is the trade-off between the cost of the interceptor and the damage that is prevented. And in this case, immense damage would be prevented. Now, to add to that, though, what happens if this missile isn't carrying a nuclear warhead, it's carrying a chemical or a biological weapon? And so a couple of numbers there with a biological weapon, with chemical weapons for a ton of weapons. You're still talking about numbers which, interestingly, start at the range of the US 9/11 attack and go up from there, potentially a factor of 10 to 100 times. We're talking about very large uncertainties here because chemical and biological weapons, the nature of the atmosphere, the nature of the winds, make huge difference in what damage is caused. And so that's all a part of the uncertainty there. All right, so then let's turn to what is South Korea saying about its defense? South Korea is facing 1,000 ballistic missiles with likely weapons of mass destruction warheads on many of them. So South Korea is talking about launching a preemptive strike, not just depending upon missile defense, but preemption. Now, we talked about instability created by missile defense. If you go to counterforce being your major response, that is potentially even more unstable, as we'll talk about in a minute. President Park, the new South Korean president, inaugurated in February of last year, talked about setting up a system with a kill chain capacity and a Korean air and missile defense. Now, this is no longer purely extended deterrence and extended defense from the United States. The Koreans have concluded that they need many of their own capabilities, and I'll show you in a minute the U.S. part of that. But they're looking at that, and they're concerned about nuclear weapons and missiles, trying to convince North Korea that they're no longer going to be useful because they've got a good enough defense to prevent them from being effective, even in small numbers potentially. They are still consulting with the U.S. forces, but they are talking about potentially executing both the counterforce and the missile defense elements here without consulting with U.S. forces. So this is not just extended deterrence. This is a major variant from extended deterrence. And it's a new development that we need to be thinking about, and the U.S. side has started to realize that this is really different. So what are we talking about in terms of actual operations? Well, to make all of this work, to be able to remove the North Korean threat, you're talking about some combination of understanding the threat, where it is, what can be done to eliminate it, being able to catch it when it gets launched, being able to intercept it en route, and so forth, the counterforce capabilities to go in and damage it, the active defenses, the missile defense that would be part of that. And note that the counterforce is not just focused on the missiles, it's focused on the weapons, potentially even leadership, command, control. It is a broader element there. South Korea is putting together a kill chain, counterforce, and a missile defense system that roughly looks like this at this point in time. And this is publicly available. It's been presented in some of their media. They're talking about putting ballistic missiles on targets in 6 to 8 minutes. And we're not talking about tens of ballistic missiles. South Korea 2 years ago got a range extension on their ballistic missiles so they could cover all of North Korea. Interesting thing, the month before that range extension was announced, South Korea put $2.5 billion in acquisition over 5 years in acquiring about 500 ballistic missiles. Now you might say, well, but they had this agreement with the United States. It was going to take them some time to do the R&D and then the acquisition on these missiles and put them in place. Well, except that South Korea did not believe that the agreement precluded the R&D process. So they are largely through the R&D process. They are very heavily by now into the acquisition process. Those 500 missiles are to be in place by 2017. So that's where they start. 6 to 8 minutes, what does that mean? Well, I mean, that means a great degree of pre-delegation. These are conventional warheads, so they're not talking about the kind of nuclear thing we were earlier today. Then cruise missiles in an hour. Both the ballistic missiles and the cruise missiles are theoretically targeting underground facilities where North Korean missiles and their launchers are stored. And that explains the preemptive nature of this. If those get dispersed out of those underground facilities, then it's very hard to hit them with ballistic missiles and with cruise missiles. You've got to catch them in their underground facilities, and to do that, you've got to be potentially preemptive. Fighter aircraft after that, armed UAVs after that, and then missile defenses. The SM-3 and the THAAD are the two elements that would directly come from the United States. South Korea does not have a medium or upper tier kind of system. They have some Patriot missiles, but those are older generation Patriot, not particularly good at missile defense. However, there are U.S. Patriot missiles also in Korea that could participate in the defense. The problem with Patriot is the range, of course, is limited. South Korea is about 4 to 5 times the size of Israel, so that gives you an idea. Trying to cover all of that area with Patriot, you're going to need a lot of Patriot batteries to do that. And there aren't that many in Korea today, only a few. All right, so what are we talking about in terms of calculations? If North Korea has 1,000 theater ballistic missiles, and maybe they've got an 80% reliability, so that 800 of them would be launched and reach targets. And if South Korea has available to it 600 interceptors, and let's say they've got a 70% kill probability, then something in the range of 380 missiles are going to reach target over time. That's an unacceptable outcome if those are carrying weapons of mass destruction, especially. You know, if North Korea has 20 nuclear weapons, that means about 10 of them are going to arrive in South Korea. We're not talking about one, we're talking about many. And let me guarantee you the difference between one nuclear weapon going off in a country and 5 or 10 or more nuclear weapons going off is immense. Certainly no one wants one to go off, but you really don't want a lot more. So that's the starting calculation. So why doesn't South Korea just buy the missile defenses? To deal with this size threat, we're talking about, for the interceptors alone, a cost in the neighborhood of $15 to $20 billion. just for the defenses. The South Korean research, development, and acquisition military budget each year is $9 billion right now. It's roughly 5% of the similar U.S. budgets. They just don't have the budget to do it. So what did they do? They concluded that the ideal concept was, let's add a counterforce element. They already had the fighter aircraft. They've already built the cruise missiles. They just needed to build the ballistic missiles. So if their counterforce capability can kill 600 missiles, and then on top of that, they can get the missile defenses to apply just to the 320 remaining missiles that would get launched, you're going to cut the numbers down significantly. If your counterforce is even better still, the numbers go lower. And so for them, this counterforce capability, this $2.5 billion they spent, they're hoping that it's going to replace the 15, 20, perhaps $30 billion of the missile defenses that they would otherwise need. But there are liabilities to going to that kind of counterforce approach. Now, historically, the problem with deterrence is you're looking at benefits versus costs for the adversary. The adversary wants to conquer South Korea. He wants to operationally disrupt airfields and logistics. He wants to coerce and attack cities. And if the only thing we're talking about is a retaliation from South Korea that comes from North Korea using these ballistic missiles, well, they may not stop the conquest of South Korea. They may not stop any of these other factors. And so North Korea may well not be deterred. What South Korea is hoping is that if they do this, they disrupt they stop the capability of North Korea to disrupt and coerce. And if North Korea doesn't win an invasion of the South, the regime is going to be destroyed. That has always been the stated South Korean end state. That if North Korea invades the South and they lose, the regime is gone. And that is unacceptable to the North. And so that is how the South is hoping to achieve deterrence. But the challenge is, timing is everything here. If North Korea disperses its missiles out of their underground storage facilities, then those ballistic missiles and cruise missiles they're going to try to use to destroy them aren't going to be very effective. And so here you've got North Korea thinking of going to war, and South Korea trying to defend against it, and the North saying, well, should I flush my missiles out? And the South saying, should I try to preempt? You have a fundamentally unstable situation. Far more unstable than simply if missile defenses were the issue. And the question becomes, do you get stuck in some kind of escalatory spiral here as you start getting into counterforce or other kinds of things? And in particular, according to the statements earlier, does South Korea start operating? I mean, they still are technically under a U.S. military commander, but could South Korea execute this without U.S. approval, which they are talking about doing, and lead to essentially a breakdown of the alliance? So we have some interesting dynamics developing here. I'm going to stop there and let you all transition to questions.